In this episode, we speak with Justin Borgman, founder and CEO of Starburst, a data platform that provides fast, secure access to distributed data across clouds, on-premises systems, and hybrid environments. Built on open source Trino, Starburst helps organizations unify their data without costly migrations, enabling advanced analytics and AI at scale. Today, the company is trusted by enterprises in more than 60 countries for mission-critical applications. Justin founded Starburst in 2017 after serving as vice president and GM at Teradata, which acquired his prior company, Hadapt, an early pioneer of SQL-on-Hadoop. I'm your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoy the show. If you like the episode, click to follow.
RJ Lumba is the executive chairman of Market Insight Media and managing partner of GrowthCap. He is the host of Key Executives, a podcast for driven executives and business operators. Our podcast covers all topics related to effective business leadership, from strategy and culture to products and services to sales and marketing and everything in between. In the minutes ahead, we'll share with you unique insights and tactics from some of today's most accomplished and inspiring executives.
Justin, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I think a good place to start is to talk about big data, because over many years, big data has seemed to become proliferated by more and more companies. And at one point, all we could talk about maybe a decade and a half ago was big data and how it was going to impact the rest of technology, the rest of the software industry. It's receded in terms of people's immediate kind of attention. Everything is on AI now, which of course is related to big data. But the buzzword is AI versus big data. Tell us about the evolution of the big data industry.
Sure. Yeah. So maybe I'll go back 25 years to start here, which would be really the acceleration of the internet and internet companies and search engines like Google and Yahoo. And a lot of that actually motivated the development of these big data technologies that we now leverage ubiquitously. And the motive really was just simply size, which is what gave the name, big data, the big to big data, if you will. And, indexing the internet requires a massive amount of data being captured. And that really spurred companies like Google to invest in and develop the first versions of these big data technologies. Way back in the early 2000s, there was something called MapReduce. That was how Google actually managed and processed the insane amounts of data that they had from indexing the web. And that technology then gave way to technologies like Hadoop 15 years ago, really the first data lake, if you will. And we've been continuously iterating since then. But I think what really has driven that is that big data moved from being a internet company problem, a search engine problem, or maybe a Facebook problem, if you will, to being a much more commonplace challenge for really businesses of all shapes and sizes that are data-driven. And I think we're all increasingly data-driven. And you made a very important point there, which is the interrelationship between these big data technologies and AI, because I think that getting your data infrastructure, your foundation set, is actually a prerequisite to being able to do really interesting things with AI, leveraging your own data. It's one thing to use ChatGPT and have some fun with the data that they've crawled, but it's much more powerful when you're pulling in your own enterprise data to really create proprietary advantage, leveraging the context you have from your own enterprise. And that's where big data, if you will, meets AI.
And you had a profound insight years ago when you discovered Hadoop. And I believe you were at Yale at the time. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came up with the insight and then how you went about finding your future co-founders?
Yeah, so this was 2010 timeframe. And I had a software engineering background. I had an undergraduate degree in computer science, but I was actually getting my MBA at the time and read a research paper written by a guy named Daniel Abadi, a young professor there, and his PhD student, Kamil Pawlikowski. And the paper was called Hadoop DB. And Hadoop was a pretty emerging technology, but what was so novel about this paper was really thinking about Hadoop as a database, as a DB, if you will. And that was really what the research was all about, was applying a SQL interface to allow you to do traditional data warehousing analytics, the types of things that you would have previously spent millions of dollars on with Oracle or Teradata or IBM. You can now do very cost effectively and at a very great scale, leveraging Hadoop and this Hadoop DB concept, if you will. And so that led to my first company, which was really commercializing that research with Daniel and Camille. They became my co-founders. And we built that business over 4 years, ultimately being acquired actually by Teradata and spending some time there post-acquisition.
And you seem to have a knack for going right to the pioneering technology and forming a company around that and building that company, scaling that company. Let's head into now the founding story of Starburst.
Yeah, so Starburst was really formulated, I would say, in that period post-acquisition for my first company, spending time at Teradata. My job at Teradata was actually to think about the future of data warehousing and look beyond the traditional data warehouse. So I have a lot of respect and appreciation for the leaders at the time that gave me this latitude to explore. It was sort of like they wanted me to try to help address the innovator's dilemma. I think Teradata is a classic innovator's dilemma story where the industry was changing around them. They were the leader, they were the pioneer in data warehousing, but the industry was transforming so quickly and they needed to figure out how to address that. And so during my time there, I got to explore and I was looking at open source technologies, cloud technologies, and that's really where I discovered this technology at Facebook that back then was called Presto. Today it's known as Trino, but it's an open source project that allows you to run analytics on data in a data lake, but also distributed data as well, data that lives in multiple data sources. And I thought that was a really interesting concept because one of my observations at Teradata was that despite them being the industry leader for a number of decades, they were like the snowflake before Snowflake, if you will. Not one of their customers actually had all of their data in Teradata. It just became impossible. And that was a lesson born out of 30 years of experience that Teradata had at that point. And so I thought, well, this technology could actually be the solution, the sort of unifier by being able to provide connectivity to all of the data that an enterprise has, whether that's in a lake, a traditional database, a data warehouse, a NoSQL database, a cloud, on-prem. It was this sort of single point of access to all of your data. And that's what got me excited about it initially. And so me and a few members of my team ultimately left Teradata to form Starburst to really bring that idea to life and commercialize it.
What was the limitation at the time? Why wasn't a data company able to unify all different types of data, the comprehensive set?
It was really sort of antithetical to, I think, just the way that database companies had been built up to that point, which was partly technical, but partly business reason. And I'll explain what I mean by that. On the technical side, there was this belief that controlling your own storage and optimizing the storage was necessary to achieve great performance. And so all the databases that came before us had their own proprietary storage that was highly optimized for the query engine component. You can think of a database as really like two parts, the query component, the storage component. And those were always joined together and optimized for one another. And so the idea of breaking that apart and really allowing the query engine to access all types of storage was a new idea at the time. The other reason, the business reason, is that storage piece, that proprietary storage actually creates lock-in, which is bad for customers, but good for vendors. And so, if you think about the story of Oracle, quite frankly, it's a story of lock-in. I don't think there are many Oracle customers today, despite their recent stock performance, that would say, I love my Oracle database and the fact that I can't get my data out of it. I think the reality is that lock-in is what has built such a big business for them, but it's also led customers to feel trapped. And I think that was also true in the data warehouse space. And it's part of what has driven, I think, a lot of the interest around open formats today, particularly formats like Iceberg, which have gained tremendous popularity.
So you mentioned Oracle and Iceberg, and I'm wondering if we can help give the audience some insight into the market landscape, like in where Starburst sits. Like what is Starburst excellent at and outcompetes at compared to others in the market?
Yeah, so I would say fundamentally, if you believe that Iceberg or open formats in general, with Iceberg being kind of the leading contender there, that's where you want to store the majority of your data as much as you can, then you want to find a query engine that's well paired to work with those Iceberg tables. And really from Iceberg's first beginnings at Netflix, they were running our queries from Trino or Presto as it was known before it on those Iceberg tables. In fact, they were kind of made for each other, really. So there's a lot of history there in the open source community of these two technologies working together. And as a commercial company, we've really made that easier and faster and built out kind of the full end-to-end lifecycle from ingesting into Iceberg tables, either as files or streaming ingest, managing and optimizing those tables, and then of course, querying them with our query engines. So that's one piece. And then I think the other piece is, whether or not you believe that you will probably have data outside of the lake or outside of traditional data warehouses as well. And our belief, very much so, is that there will always be heterogeneity in the data landscape because there will always be these purpose-built systems. There will always be disparate teams creating their own piece of an architecture where the data at the end of the day is going to be valuable to either an analyst or now in the future, AI agents that will need that context in conjunction with the other data in the enterprise. And that's again where I think we're uniquely positioned because of our federation capability, where we can join data from multiple data sources, and we can do that in a very secure and controlled way. It's one of the reasons that financial services, for example, happens to be one of our largest verticals. Today, we serve 10 of the 15 largest banks, and those banks are really the epitome of complexity. They have every possible data source you can imagine, and being able to move all of that data around becomes impractical. So being able to access and query it directly has a lot of benefits to that.
You mentioned financial services. What are some of the other sectors that you think your solution is most helpful for?
So I think any business that has a degree of scale to it. So, probably our second biggest vertical would be technology companies.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the big technology names that you've heard of are users and customers of our technology because of the scale. And the scale would be cost prohibitive for them to use a traditional data warehousing technology. So being able to scale in a cost-effective manner is one of the reasons that those types of businesses end up choosing us, because the volumes of data that they have are just so extreme, you couldn't use necessarily a traditional technology. We also do well in other regulated industries. So healthcare, other aspects of financial services like insurance, telcos, companies that have to contend with global data privacy, data sovereignty constraints. Again, you're going to have disparate data sources when you have to deal with those types of laws and regulations. And those are challenges that we're well suited to solve.
Can you give us a sense for the scale of the company today?
Yeah, we don't share our revenue figures, but we are over 400 employees today. We've raised over 400 million in venture capital in our journey here. And, we think we're on an IPO path and continuing to grow at a great growth rate as we expand towards that goal.
Tell us about your team. Is the original founding team still there in kind of C-level roles?
A large portion of it is. We actually started with a lot of co-founders. We actually had 12, I think, technically. And that's because, we were born out of that open source project, and we wanted to bring together as many of those leading contributors to the project into the company as possible. As we've evolved, it's been, a 7.5-year journey. Some of those folks have moved on to different roles in the company. Some of them have moved into leadership roles. Some of them are still in individual contributor roles, and a few of them have left along the way. But most of the team is still here. And on the executive team and on the board are still, Martin Traverso, who's one of the creators of Trino. He's our CTO, and Matt Fuller, another one of my co-founders, who's a VP of product for us.
Mm-hmm. You have some fantastic investors backing the company. And I think you were very intentional about when you decided to bring in outside capital. You have some kind of philosophies on maybe when it's too early to take in outside capital. How do you think your approach with Starburst and capital has helped set up the company in maybe a more stable and more methodical journey?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I would do the early part of Starburst over again in a second, the same exact way. So we started, for your listeners' benefit, we started without raising any capital at all. We were actually bootstrapped. And one of the things that I love about that is that we had complete control without any scrutiny or questioning over the changes that we made, from one day to the next. And I think in those early days, you have to be very flexible, very open to, the term pivot gets thrown around a lot. I think pivot often refers to giant changes that you might make later on in the business. But I would argue that in the early days of the business, you're pivoting almost every week as you learn more information from your customers. And so being bootstrapped allowed us to be very customer centric, allowed us to adapt to what we were seeing and make a lot of little small changes every week without having to justify or explain them to a board or group of investors. It also gave us a lot of leverage later on when we did choose to raise, because at that point we were cash flow positive, we were profitable, and we didn't need the money. And I think in any negotiation, you're always strongest when you have the opportunity to walk away and say, this is not the right deal for me. And so that gave us a lot of leverage in that process when we did decide to fundraise. So I highly recommend it if you can try it. I do think a lot of founders raise too early, in my opinion. And I get it. The whole journey is hard, so I don't want to pass judgment necessarily. But I think some founders raise money because they need a salary themselves. And I don't think that's the best reason to raise, because you're essentially diluting your ownership and giving up control for the sake of a salary. And everybody's in a different situation. Maybe they have to do that. But I would say, to the extent that you can try to prepare for your entrepreneurial journey and put some money aside and be willing to kind of go without a salary for an extended period of time, maybe even a year, while you sort of suffer through the early innings of the business, I think you'll be much better off at the end of that year once you've assembled everything, created real value, and then go on to raise money to scale and grow.
You mentioned road to IPO, and the broader capital markets, private markets has continued to grow, and many companies are thinking, well, we'll stay private for the foreseeable future. But you have an eye towards an IPO. Why is that?
I think the main reason is really providing an avenue for liquidity for the employees who've been in this journey. You're absolutely right that companies are staying private longer. And I think there's the latitude to do that. I think investors, or at least a lot of investors, are patient enough to go along with that. And certainly you see that with Databricks, for example, which has been private an extremely long time at this point. But there is that aspect of, the employee stakeholder as well. And I think they count on the equity compensation as being part of their total compensation. And so they want to see a path to liquidity to that. You can do that through secondaries, and certainly that's another path to do it. But, IPO is perhaps the most straightforward path for long-term liquidity opportunities for employees.
We're entering the tail end of the conversation. We have two final questions, but I'd like to touch on you personally. If you could tell us a little bit more about yourself. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? Did you always have an interest in technology and business building?
Yeah, so I grew up just outside of Boston in a town called Acton, Massachusetts. Went to public school there. Had a great, early education. It was a sort of a competitive public school that I think set me up well for life and the competitive dynamics of technology, certainly. And I think one of the things that inspired me growing up, for me, like my formative teenage years were really in the 90s, when you saw that first leg of internet company development and so many businesses that were literally transforming our lives. And I think that potential to have impact in a very profound way was something that stuck with me from that point, that I saw, Cisco and Microsoft and Google really transform the way that we lived as a society. And I thought, geez, if I could have an impact to positively improve the world through technology, that would be super gratifying, super rewarding. Not to mention, of course, it's an avenue to create wealth and independence and so forth as well. But those were things that stuck with me, I would say, in my teenage years, motivated me to go get a degree in computer science, become a software engineer, later on going to business school and launching my first company.
Last question. can you tell us about a person who has had a profound influence on you?
There have been many. I've been lucky enough to have a lot of mentors along the way in different capacities. But if I had to choose the number one, it would be my mom. She taught me not only the value of hard work, she's an extremely hardworking person, but also the importance of perseverance and determination, which I think are necessary ingredients for entrepreneurship. If anyone is thinking about being a founder out there, this is not for the faint of heart, as they say. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And you will constantly find yourself tested in terms of your own ability to sort of push through pain. I love Jensen Huang's quotes on this topic of, I wish great suffering upon a lot of you, because that's really what allows you to become the best that you can be. And I was very fortunate to learn that sort of mental fortitude by just watching my mom firsthand. And she continues to be a great inspiration to me today.
Wonderful. Well, Justin, thank you so much again for taking the time.
Thank you.